You walk beneath Rome, and the air grows thick, older than breath itself. Stone changes here. It hums faintly as though remembering the pressure of something once alive. The corridors are narrow, their arches bent like spines that learned to bow. Somewhere beyond the tourist tunnels and marble crypts lies a wall that no map admits, sealed with cement darker than night. They say that behind it burns a light that has never gone out. Not a candle, not a relic, an ember, a remnant from an age before Christ, before empire, before any throne dared to call its fire divine. The priests who tended it spoke the language of the stars. They measured holiness not by obedience, but by radiance. How clear the conscience, how steady the flame. When Rome swallowed their homeland, it took their books, their gold, their silence, but it could not kill their idea. In the centuries that followed, pilgrims built basilicas above their ashes. Marble altars rose where clay hearths had once glowed. Each new layer of faith buried another beneath it. And yet sometimes, when the evening bells fall quiet, archivists in the lowest vaults claim to feel warmth seeping through the floor. No light, only warmth, a pulse without source. They call it superstition, but superstition is only memory without context. Every empire inherits its own ghosts. Rome's are made of fire. They whisper through its stones, murmuring of a creed that needed no priests. A creed that taught, truth is not to be worshipped but lived. To the rulers of men, that was an unforgivable doctrine, because a people who carry the altar inside themselves no longer kneel. Imagine the first excavators who dug beneath St. Peter's Hill. Their torches sputtered in stale air, glimmering across corridors lined with bones and broken amphorae. Then a change. Soot layered so densely it swallowed flame, as if a chamber had once burned for generations. In that soot they found no idols, only traces of ash, crystalline as powdered glass. Chemical tests, the reports say, found nothing holy, only purity beyond explanation. From those fragments rose a rumor that beneath the Vatican sleeps a secret older than scripture, a covenant written in light. The Magi of Persia called it Asha, the order of truth, the breath of creation. To live in Asha was to live awake, aligned with the universe's heartbeat. The Romans called it blasphemy, for it required no intercessor, no temple, no permission. So they sealed it under stone and called the place consecrated. They renamed the fire Salvation and forgot who first lit it. But forgetting is never absolute. Even marble remembers heat. Even silence keeps rhythm. Somewhere below the catacombs, records mention a vault, unlisted, unnumbered, marked only with the word Persia. No catalogue follows it. The index jumps ahead as though a page had been swallowed. When a scholar once asked about it, an old archivist smiled and said, "That room no longer exists." Then he paused and added, "At least not for us." There is a certain geometry to suppression. It builds upward, each truth supporting the lie above it. Cathedrals are perfect examples, foundations older than the creeds they uphold. Every arch, every rose window, every candlelit nave is balanced upon the mathematics of those forgotten priests of light. They knew the weight of harmony long before Rome learnt the word grace. If you listen closely in St. Peter's Basilica, when the tourists have gone, you can hear a faint vibration beneath the choir's echo. Not music, not machinery, something slower, like breath against stone. Perhaps it is the city's heart, or perhaps it is the old fire dreaming through its walls. For what is memory but flame that refuses to die? Legends claim that deep beneath the papal archives, a lamp still burns in a sealed glass globe, its fuel never replenished. The story surfaces every few generations, denied, ridiculed, then quietly retold. Skeptics call it metaphor, believers call it proof, but the distinction hardly matters. Both names describe the same phenomenon, a light that survives the will to extinguish it. Maybe the real lamp is not in Rome at all. Maybe it flickers in every mind that refuses to surrender its wonder. Zoroaster's followers called that flame Fravashi, the divine spark inside all beings. It is said that if even one person keeps it pure, the balance of creation endures. So perhaps the hidden fire beneath Rome is simply the collective glow of all who still choose truth over comfort. Every night, the city sleeps upon layers of conquest and belief. Emperors, popes, and pilgrims pass above without noticing the slow warmth that breathes through the stone. But if you could stand in that darkness long enough, you might feel it, a tremor older than the cross. A promise whispered through ash. Nothing buried stays silent forever. And when the day comes that the vault cracks and air meets ember again, it will not be a miracle or a curse. It will be recognition, the world remembering what it tried to forget. For the hidden flame beneath Rome was never truly hidden. It has been waiting, steady and patient, for us to see that the fire was never theirs to guard. It was always ours to keep. Long before the church claimed dominion over heaven's light, another faith taught that light already lived within the human heart. It began in a land of mountains and dry wind, where dawn arrived not gently but like revelation. The Persians called it the faith of the flame, not for what it worshipped, but for what it remembered. Fire was never their god. It was their conscience made visible. To them, tending a flame was the same as tending awareness. They called their prophet Zarathustra, the seeker who saw the universe divide itself into two rhythms, Asha and Druj, truth and deception, order and distortion. He taught that creation was not a finished act, but an ongoing conversation, and every human word joined it. Asha was the law of harmony, the pulse of clarity running through all existence. To live outside, it was to live blind, to feed the lie that shadow was stronger than light. The priests of the fire temples did not demand worship. They demanded vigilance. Their commandment was simple: keep the fire steady. Each morning, before the first bird's cry, they entered the sanctum barefoot. The air was so clean it stung. Sand and ash lined the floor to guard the purity of the flame. They bowed not out of fear, but out of recognition that what burned before them was the same brightness that stirred behind their eyes. Asha, Vahishta, they whispered, truth is the best good. Outside, the desert wind howled, but within those walls the silence was absolute, like the pause between heartbeats. In that pause, they said, you could hear the world being made again. To outsiders, it looked like fire worship. To those who listened, it was philosophy spoken in light. Each spark was a syllable, each breath of air a prayer. The temple was both observatory and mind, its chimney open to the stars. When the priests read the constellations, they were not seeking prophecy, but confirmation, proof that the cosmos itself obeyed the same law as the flame balance, renewal, clarity. No idols stood in those sanctuaries, no images of gods or saints, only the fire and the mirror of conscience it offered. Children were taught that evil was not an external monster, but a moment of forgetfulness. Forget, and the fire falters. Remember, and it brightens. The faith of fire was not about salvation after death. It was about awareness in life that made it dangerous. Kingdoms thrive on obedience. Awareness asks questions. When traders from the West reached Persia, They found a people who measured purity by intention, not blood. They saw priests in white tending flames that never died and mistook discipline for devotion. They worship fire, the Romans wrote, and call it God. But translation is a knife. It cuts meaning to fit the hand that holds it. The Persians did not bow to the flame. They bowed to the principle it embodied, that the divine needs no image, only reflection. Even the architecture of their temples taught this. Each chamber was built with precise geometry so that light entered only at certain hours, forming a moving pattern across the walls. At dawn, the flame merged with the sunbeam through the ceiling aperture. At dusk, it separated again. Day and night enacted the eternal dialogue of truth and illusion. The priests said that when one truly understood this dance, the boundary between outer and inner light disappeared. That moment of merging was called Dina vision, not revelation from above, but clarity from within. Centuries later, when missionaries arrived preaching salvation through intermediaries, they found no converts. The Magi listened politely and returned to their fires. "We already know the light," they said. "We carry it." That answer terrified Rome more than any sword. How do you rule a people who believe the sacred is self-sustaining? You cannot conquer them. You must rename them. So began the slow erasure. Scrolls of the Avesta, the holy verses, were seized as curiosities, translated and quietly altered. Words for conscience became words for guilt. The law of Asha became the command of God. Over time, the faith of fire was recast as superstition, its philosophy fragmented into myth. But the flame survived in memory, in architecture, in the secret grammar of morality itself. Every time someone spoke honestly despite fear, they said, "The fire brightened a little somewhere in the world." Perhaps that is why cathedrals still glow with candlelight long after the sun has set. Perhaps the instinct to light a flame in darkness is older than doctrine. The Persians would say it is the soul's reflex, the ancient memory of its own illumination. Even now, when a candle flickers on an altar in Rome, the gesture traces back through centuries of translation to a desert temple where a priest once whispered to the flame, "You are not mine to keep, only mine to remember." And so the faith of fire endures, disguised as ritual, hidden in every act of clarity. It asks for no followers, only witnesses, people willing to see that truth, like flame, cannot be owned. It can only be tended. In the oldest fragments of the Avesta, the ink itself seems to breathe. The letters curl and shimmer like waves seen through heat. They speak of a law older than commandment, older than priest or king. The Persians called it Asha, the order of truth, the spine of creation. It is not a rule imposed from above, but a rhythm that holds the universe together, the same cadence that makes a flame rise straight, that keeps the stars in their silent circuits. Asha cannot be taught, it can only be remembered. To live by Asha is to align one's breath with the pattern of the world, to speak without distortion, to think without envy, to act without fear. When that alignment falters, when a word is spoken falsely or an act born of deceit, the balance trembles. And what steps in to fill the fracture is Druj, the lie. Not merely a falsehood, but the power that twists harmony into noise. The priests of Zoroaster never built prisons for sinners. Their temples were laboratories of balance. When a man lied, he was not condemned. He was corrected, as a builder might adjust a leaning wall. They believed that the cosmos listens. Every word is weight. Every thought leaves geometry in the air. Asha responds to sincerity the way a flame responds to breath too hard, and it bends. Too soft, and it dies. In later centuries, Theologians tried to explain this as morality, as good and evil, but those are blunt tools. Asha and Druj are subtler. They are the architecture of consequence. One sustains, the other corrodes. Zoroaster described them not as enemies, but as choices made infinite. Every human moment tips the scale. Truth is not the opposite of falsehood. It is the condition in which existence can endure. Consider a craftsman in ancient Persepolis carving the name of a king into stone. If his hand slips, if pride interrupts precision, that small deviation becomes a fracture that will one day split the wall. The lie is not a word. It is a vibration. Rome would later call such belief superstition, yet even Roman engineers learned the same lesson. Structures built without balance crumble. The earliest students of Asha studied not only prayers, but astronomy, medicine, and law. They sought the same harmony in the sky, in the body, and in the city. To them, ethics and physics were twin tongues of the same truth. The pulse of the heart mirrored the orbit of a planet. Justice mirrored the trajectory of light. To violate Asha was to introduce disease first into the soul, then into the soil. A harvest failed not because gods were angry, but because men had lived crookedly. When conquerors came, they misread Asha as doctrine, as something to legislate or weaponize. They carved commandments into stone and called them eternal. But Asha is not a commandment. It is a consequence. It needs no priest to enforce it, only gravity. The Romans preferred their truths static, their gods enthroned. The Persians knew truth moves. It hums through time, adjusting itself to the motion of minds that dare to stay honest. Even now, the ruins of fire temples keep that rhythm. If you listen at dawn, when wind threads through the empty arches, you can almost hear the pulse. It is the sound of equilibrium, faint but insistent. Asha has no temple, no scripture uncorrupted, yet it endures wherever integrity resists decay. The Vatican archives mention the word only once, buried in a 17th century treatise on heresies, Asha, the false law of the Persians, teaching truth without grace. The irony is perfect, for Asha needs no grace because it was never a bargain. Grace forgives, Asha remembers. It measures every motion, then balances the sum. Perhaps this is why so many institutions fear it. You cannot absolve yourself from physics, and you cannot bribe truth. To live in Asha is to surrender all intermediaries. You become both judge and judged, both altar and flame. That kind of freedom feels like danger to any power built on control. In quiet moments, when conscience stirs and you feel the subtle discomfort of dishonesty that is not guilted, is Asha adjusting your center. The Persians taught that even a whisper of truth can recalibrate the world, that one honest act can ripple through centuries. The universe, they said, is self-correcting, but only if we help it remember its shape. Every civilization builds walls to contain belief, but Asha flows through cracks. It is the current that erodes empires and nourishes whatever grows after them. The Roman catacombs, the Persian qanats, the lines of light in a stained glass window wall are instruments of the same law. As above, so below. As within, so without. One day, the flames of the temples will die, the scrolls will fade, and even the stars will cool. Yet the rhythm of Asha will persist, carried in the smallest act of sincerity, because truth, unlike fire, does not need oxygen. It needs witnesses. And that is all the faith of Asha ever asked us to be. In the long silence between empires, when night stretched unbroken across the plateau of Persia, there were watchers who did not sleep. They were called Magi, the keepers of the flame, the interpreters of the heavens. To the common eye, they were priests. To themselves, they were listeners. They listened to the stars. They listened to the way light bent across darkness and learned that the sky was not a ceiling but a map. They built their observatories like temples, wide and open to the breath of the wind. Each wall faced a constellation. Each arch mirrored an orbit. The fire that burned within was not an offering but an instrument. Its steady flame, a ruler against which the trembling of starlight could be measured. When the sky flickered, they adjusted the wick. When the stars dimmed, they whispered hymns to recall balance. In those chambers, science and sanctity were the same discipline. The Magi spoke of two kinds of light. One came from the heavens, cold and distant. The other burned within the mind, warm and near. The wise lived at the intersection, where celestial order met human conscience. They called this meeting Fravashi, the soul's memory of its own origin. To lose sight of the stars was to forget where that inner light began. To neglect the inner flame was to misread the cosmos. In the oldest myths, these magi did not worship planets, they conversed with them. Saturn was not a god but a teacher of patience, Jupiter a keeper of mercy. Venus taught harmony, Mars discipline. The sky was a classroom of principles, not deities. And yet, when foreign traders and soldiers encountered them, the simplicity of that wisdom was mistaken for sorcery. They called them magicians, as if understanding light were a form of trickery. When Rome extended its reach eastward, it absorbed everything it could not destroy. The Magi were among the last to surrender. Their libraries were taken, their altars desecrated, but their charts remained vast mosaics of stars painted on clay and parchment. Those maps would one day guide other seekers, long after the Magi's names had turned to dust. Centuries later, storytellers would write of three of them following a strange star toward a child in Bethlehem. They became symbols of devotion, not understanding, followers, not teachers. But the Magi of the Avesta had already predicted such a conjunction. The meeting of Jupiter and Saturn in the constellation of Pisces. To them, it was a sign of renewal, the moment when wisdom and compassion crossed paths in the firmament. What they sought was not a king, but the continuity of light through the ages. Imagine them on that journey, their robes lined with sand, their eyes reflecting the slow dance of planets. They carry not gifts of submission, but symbols. Gold for the sun, frankincense for the breath, myrrh for the body's impermanence. Each item a formula, not a tribute. When they finally arrive and kneel before the child, it is not worship they offer, but recognition. The flame has found another vessel. The church would later rewrite their story, stripping away the mathematics, the astronomy, the philosophy, until all that remained were crowns and names. Yet their true legacy persisted in secret orders, in the whispered exchange of star charts between monks and scholars. Even within the Vatican, certain astronomers kept the Magi's methods alive under different titles, tracing orbits in candlelight as though reciting prayer. The Magi taught that to understand the heavens was to mirror them. Every human soul, they said, is a constellation drawn on the fabric of time. We move through one another's light, altering trajectories, weaving stories that repeat across millennia. Destiny is not a script, but a pattern seen from a great distance. What looks like fate is only perspective. In their discipline, prediction was an act of humility. To foresee was not to control, but to participate in rhythm. The stars, they said, do not rule men. They remind them. The fire within us burns according to the same chemistry as suns 1,000 light years away. To forget that unity is to break Asha. To remember it is to heal the fracture between heaven and earth. When the last of the fire temples fell, a few magi fled west, disguised as physicians and builders. Their knowledge scattered like sparks, finding shelter in places that still valued silence and precision, the libraries of Byzantium, the monasteries of Ireland, the guilds of masons who learned to draw circles of perfect proportion. Centuries later, those proportions would rise again in cathedrals, stone echoes of stellar geometry. If you stand beneath the dome of any great church and look upward, you are seeing the sky translated into architecture, the same circles the Magi once traced in sand by starlight. Their fire burns there still, transmuted into glass and symmetry. The Vatican does not deny this influence. It simply no longer speaks its name. To the Magi, truth was not revelation, but observation. Look long enough at the stars, they said, and you will begin to hear yourself thinking. The universe is not silent, it is waiting for an echo. And so they listened, century after century, listening for the sound of the divine reflected back as human clarity. That was their heresy and their grace, to seek God not in thunder or decree, but in the steady hum of light moving through darkness. They were never magicians, they were mirrors, and like all mirrors, they frightened those who could not bear to see what they reflected. There is a city in the desert where the wind sings through towers of clay. Its name is Yazd, and at its heart burns a flame that has not died for over 1,000 years. They say it is the same fire once lit in the age of Zoroaster, carried from temple to temple through war, exile, and sandstorm. The keepers call it a Tashberum, the victorious flame. To step into its chamber is to enter a silence so complete that it feels alive. The air is warm but not suffocating. The smoke never rises because there is none. The fire burns clean, no crackle, no ash, just motion made of light. A priest moves slowly around it, his robe pale as salt. Every gesture is deliberate. He breathes through a veil to keep his breath from touching the fire, for even air unpurified can corrupt its clarity. In his hands, he holds a pair of silver tongs. With them, he adds a single stick of dry sandalwood, washed and dried for days beneath the sun. When the wood catches, the flame does not flare, it accepts. The difference is sacred. The ceremony has no sermon, no chant of forgiveness. It is a dialogue between consciousness and its reflection. Each spark that leaps upward is a syllable of creation, returning to the breath that began it. The priests do not kneel, they align. For them, the act of tending the flame is not worship, but maintenance, a reminder that truth, like fire, survives only through care. Neglected, and the world cools into apathy. Feed it wrongly, and it becomes destruction. They call this practice Atar Yasata, the adoration of purity. But purity, in the Zoroastrian sense, is not moral. It is mathematical. Every movement inside the chamber follows pattern. 7 steps around the hearth, 3 bowings to the cardinal points, 2 breaths between gestures. Each number echoes a law of balance, the geometry of Asha made visible. Outside, dust storms swirl across the desert, yet within those walls, not even a shadow crosses the flame. The priests say that shadow itself is the lie, Druge, and their duty is to give it no place to rest. It is said that Alexander's soldiers once entered a temple like this and froze, unable to move. They had come to plunder gold, but found only light. When one of them reached out to touch the flame, his armor reflected it so brightly that he mistook his own reflection for fire. The priest watching whispered, "You see, It burns without consuming. The soldier dropped his hand. No one spoke again. Some stories say he left his sword there as an offering to what he could not conquer. The design of the fire temple itself is unlike any church or mosque. There are no seats, no pulpits, no altars. The worshipper stands in an antechamber facing a window of glass that separates him from the flame. The division is not punishment, it is metaphor. Truth, they say, can be seen clearly only when there is distance enough for reflection. You cannot stand inside the fire and still perceive it. You must face it, hold still, and let it teach you to become the mirror. Even the building's architecture breathes. Channels carved into the walls guide air in spirals, feeding the fire without wind. Every few minutes, a hush ripples through the chamber as the flow changes direction. The priests pause, as if listening for something invisible. They say the flame listens back. Atash Niesh, one of them murmurs the prayer to fire. Not a request, not a plea. It is a reminder. I am watching what watches me. To tend this flame is to live by its example. It takes nothing that is not offered freely, and it transforms everything it touches without losing itself. It illuminates, but it also exposes. When a keeper falters in spirit, the fire dims. When he lies, it flickers as if sensing imbalance. There are stories of priests who could not face it, who, after years of service, found its gaze unbearable. They left silently, their absence marked by a colder glow in the days that followed. The Zoroastrians believed that this was the true mirror of the soul. Not glass, not water, but flame, because only flame reveals form through transformation. In the heart of every person, they said, a similar fire burns. It feeds on thought, on truth, on choice. When you act with integrity, it steadies. When you deceive, it smokes. The temple is a reflection of the inner chamber each of us carries unseen. Perhaps that is why even the conquerors, the missionaries, the scholars who came later, could not bring themselves to extinguish these flames. Some were stolen and sealed in cathedrals, renamed as eternal candles. Others were copied in art. Haloed around saints and angels, the fire transfigured into glory. They did not realize that in trying to preserve the symbol, they had carried forward the message. The light does not care what name it wears. And so, beneath the domes of Rome and the towers of Yazd, the same element still burns. Some see it as divinity, others as chemistry, but to those who remember, it is consciousness itself, the presence that refuses to die. It waits for recognition, not worship. For the fire has never asked for followers, only caretakers. When the priest finishes his vigil, he bows once more, not to the flame, but to the stillness it creates around him. Outside, the desert dawn breaks in silence. The sun rises, a second fire answering the first. For a moment, both lights are equal. And in that moment, the world remembers balance. Because the fire is not God. It is how God speaks. There was a moment in history, brief, unrecorded, but immense, when the libraries of Persia breathed their last before turning to ash. Soldiers carried torches instead of truth, and what they could not understand, they burned. The conquest of light always begins with ignorance, and ignorance always begins with fear. When Alexander's generals marched through Persepolis, the fire temples were extinguished, the scrolls of the Avesta scattered to the winds. Yet the Persians whispered that the real theft happened later, not when the words were destroyed, but when they were rewritten. Centuries after the flames died, when Rome reached eastward under banners of empire. And faith emissaries brought home fragments of those same texts, trophies of wisdom from the lands they now ruled. In dark monasteries and marble halls, scribes began to translate them. The language was strange. It spoke of light as reason, of purity as order, of choice as sacred. To the Romans, these ideas were too free, too ungovernable. A truth without hierarchy was a threat to hierarchy itself. So they altered it, softly, line by line. Where the Avesta had said, "The fire lives in all men," the Latin version read, "The fire is granted to the chosen." Where it had said, "Purity is action," they wrote, "Purity is obedience." Every correction was an act of conquest. They stole not gold, but vocabulary. By changing the grammar of enlightenment, they made freedom sound like rebellion. In the vaults beneath Rome, they stored what they could not yet use. Scrolls labeled Persia, their words darkened by age. Some were copied into Latin, others sealed for later review. Among them, a priest named Marcellus found verses describing Asha as the pulse of the universe. He called it heresy. "If truth exists beyond the church," he wrote, "then the church becomes unnecessary." The line was underlined twice, then redacted. The centuries that followed were an age of silent assimilation. Concepts of cosmic order and inner light began to appear in Christian sermons, disguised in new vestments. Zoroaster's duality of Asha and Druj became heaven and hell. His fire of awareness became the Holy Spirit. His magi were canonized as saints. It was not theft by force, but by translation, a gentler kind of erasure, one that leaves no ruins to mourn. The Vatican does not deny that such borrowings occurred. All truths, they later said, find fulfillment in Christ. But the Persians had no need for fulfillment. They already lived in participation. Their truth was not a prophecy waiting to be completed. It was the structure of being itself. When Rome adopted their symbols, it stripped them of responsibility. The flame that once demanded vigilance became a candle that merely asked to be lit. There is an old Persian tale of a monk who traveled west carrying a single ember from a destroyed temple. He hid it in a bronze vessel, feeding it each night with oil. When he reached the shores of the Mediterranean, he found the monasteries already glowing with candles. "We have fire enough," they told him. But he answered, "Not this kind." They mocked him, calling him magus, magician. That word, too, was turned from a title of wisdom into a synonym for illusion. Even now, in the Vatican's sealed inventories, there are references to Oriental texts concerning the law of fire. The ledgers list them as non-doctrinal, unfit for public reading. Some of those scrolls were likely penned by the same hands that once kept the eternal flames alive. And yet, what Rome suppressed, it also preserved. The thief became an archivist without knowing it. Every act of censorship is a kind of confession. To hide something, one must first admit that it exists. The architecture of the church still carries echoes of the fire temples it absorbed. The altars face east, toward the rising sun. The sanctuaries are designed to capture shafts of morning light that ignite gold leaf and marble, making walls glow as if alive. Those patterns are not Roman inventions. They are Persian memory cast in stone. The cathedrals themselves are witnesses of the theft vessels where one truth was buried beneath another. But perhaps the theft was never complete. For what is stolen wisdom if it continues to burn in the hearts of those who read between the lines? The words changed, yes, but the rhythm remained. In every mass where candles are lit, in every hymn that speaks of divine light, the echo of the old fire can still be heard. They tried to rename it, to frame it in doctrine, but it refused to dim, because light, once seen, cannot be owned. It travels, it leaks, It teaches by reflection. The conquerors thought they had captured it in parchment and vaults. They did not realize they had only become its next custodians. The flame waits in silence, patient as time, knowing that one day the world will remember that the truest theft is not of gold or land, but of meaning, and that meaning, like light, always finds a way back through the cracks. They stole the fire, but the fire remembered their hands. History is not written in wars, but in edits. The victors do not burn books because they fear ideas. They burn them to rewrite the language that carries them. The Zoroastrians called it druge, the lie, not merely falsehood, but distortion, the twisting of meaning until it forgets itself. That is how light becomes superstition, how wisdom becomes heresy, and nowhere did that distortion cut deeper than in the words. In the Avesta, the word Mazda means wisdom. It comes from the root Maz, to think, to discern, to speak of Ahura. Mazda was not to name a deity, but to acknowledge the divine as the living intelligence of the cosmos, consciousness that sustains creation. When this word crossed into the Latin world, scribes stumbled. They could not accept divinity as thought or mind or awareness. To them, God must rule, not reason. So they translated Mazda not as wisdom, but as idol. They wrote, "The Persians worship a false god of light." The shift seems small, but in that single mistranslation, a civilization lost its mirror. Wisdom turned to magic, understanding to arrogance, inquiry to rebellion. Asha, the law of truth, was now recast as faith, a concept that required obedience instead of clarity. The word for illumination became temptation, knowledge became pride, and light, once a symbol of awareness, was renamed vanity. In candlelight, the new scribes smiled, believing they had purified the text. In reality, they had made darkness fluent. One monk, centuries later, confessed in a margin note discovered in an old codex. We change words to protect the weak from knowledge to pure, but purity does not wound, only fear does. The same hand that claimed to preserve faith quietly erased freedom, stroke by stroke. The Latin Church inherited not the fire, but its shadow, a language that no longer pointed upward, but inward toward control. There are records of a forgotten council held in the 5th century, the Concilium Ignis, the Council of Fire. Few know of it because its minutes were never copied into the official annals. In that chamber, men debated whether the Persian notion of conscience as divine light could be reconciled with Christian dogma. One bishop argued, if truth lives in every man, the priest becomes redundant. The silence that followed was long and cold. The proposal was struck out. The record ends with 3 words, Decreti Silenci. Esti. The decree of silence stands. Language, they realized, was the only battlefield that mattered. To conquer a people's tongue is to colonize their thought. Once Mazda was turned into heresy, the rest followed easily. The Magi became magicians. Their astronomy became astrology. Their science of conscience became the occult. Even the idea of questioning was branded as temptation. Thus, the oldest form of enlightenment was buried under the weight of its own vocabulary. When words break, memory breaks with them. In a monastery near the Alps, a parchment was found centuries later bearing an erased line that ultraviolet light revealed. They have taken the word Asha and made it law, but Asha was never a command, it was a rhythm. Imagine the trembling of that hand as it wrote, knowing the truth that recorded would be scraped away before dawn. The lie had already learned to disguise itself as translation, and yet, even corrupted, the words carried residue. Every copy, every retelling, preserved a spark of the original frequency. A reader with patience could still sense the pulse beneath the alterations. Scholars in later ages would remark on the uncanny resemblance between Zoroastrian hymns and Christian prayers, both praising light, both denouncing the deceiver, both calling truth an eternal flame. Coincidence, they said. But coincidences, like embers, glow because something once burned there. The corruption of words was not confined to scripture. It spread into architecture, into art, into law. The Latin lux replaced the Persian atar, but cathedrals were built to trap and display it just the same. Painters surrounded saints with halos, unknowing echoes of the priests who once kept fire alive in Yazd. Even the word spirit comes from spire, to breathe, a faint memory of the Persian idea that the sacred is what moves, not what commands. Words are seeds, and even altered ones sometimes regrow their origin. In every age, a few listeners begin to hear through the distortion, to notice that light and wisdom have always been the same syllable spoken in different tongues. Perhaps that is why languages never die completely. They wait, buried like embers, for someone to speak them honestly again. To name is to remember. To rename is to forget. The Persians said that every false word adds weight to the world, bending the axis of creation toward shadow. Every true word lifts it back toward balance. This is why, they said, speech is sacred, not because it praises, but because it shapes. Rome mastered power, but Persia mastered resonance. One ruled bodies, the other tuned souls. And though the words of light were broken, their sound still vibrates beneath all others. The quiet hum of Asha beneath the chant of history. If you listen closely enough, in the hush between prayers, you can still hear it. The language before translation, the thought before fear. It says only one thing, always the same. Truth does not need to be believed. It only needs to be spoken. In the winter of 432 AD, as Rome's empire flickered between collapse and conversion, a gathering was called inside a marble hall that smelled of wax and smoke. It was not a public council. No heralds announced its decrees. The records that remain mention it only once, under another name, Concilium Ignis, the Council of Fire. It was here, scholars believe, that the Church quietly rewrote the relationship between truth and obedience. The transformation was subtle, almost invisible, like a candle relit with another's flame. Witnesses described 20 men seated in a circle, their robes heavy with authority. Before them lay a collection of Eastern manuscripts, smuggled from the ruins of the Persian cities, fragments of the Avesta, still smelling faintly of ash. The translators had done their work, but the results disturbed the bishops. These pages spoke not of sin or salvation, but of balance. They claimed the divine spark lived in everyone. They said that good and evil were choices, not decrees. That the sacred was not owned by priests, but reflected through conscience. To the elders of Rome, this was blasphemy disguised as reason. One bishop struck the table with his hand. "If this be truth," he said, "then power has no meaning." Silence followed, deep as stone. Someone suggested compromise to retain the poetry, but change the premise. "Let us keep their light," he said, "but make it shine through our window." And so, with quills dipped in borrowed ink, the council began to recast the vocabulary of a civilization. Asha, the living order of truth, became Fide's faith, redefined as trust in the Church, rather than alignment with reality. Mazda, divine wisdom, was softened into grottier grace, something bestowed from above, not discovered within. Even Droge, the lie, was rewritten as a devil, external and anthropomorphic, safely removed from the hearts of men. By separating the sacred from the self, they created dependency. And dependency, they understood, endures longer than conquest. The scribes worked for nights without rest, candlelight trembling over parchment. Some hesitated, uneasy at the gravity of their task. An old monk named Severin, whose notes survive in fragments, wrote privately, "We make prisons of the very words that once freed the soul." A year later, his writings were confiscated. His name was erased from the registry, but one line of his commentary remained. Faint and half-burned, they have built a wall of light to hide the sun. The new theology spread quietly at first. Sermons began to replace wisdom with warning. Light was preached not as awareness but as revelation received only through proper channels. The idea that God might speak directly to the heart was labeled arrogance, the oldest sin. And yet, behind the altars, the very symbols of Zoroastrianism lingered unchanged. The flame, the mirror, the winged disc, the form was preserved. Only the meaning was turned inward. The church became a cathedral built of Persian metaphors, its foundations laid upon forgotten truth. It was a brilliant inversion. The same laws of Asha that once empowered free thought now reinforced obedience. Truth was no longer the axis of creation. It was the property of doctrine. To question the hierarchy became not inquiry, but rebellion. The balance had been flipped. Awareness became pride, doubt became sin, silence became virtue. From that silence, a millennium of darkness began. But corruption never travels alone. It always leaves a shadow of its opposite. A few within the council could not bear the distortion. They copied the Persian passages by hand, hiding them in margins of other texts. The heresy in miniature, as later inquisitors would call it. These fragments would resurface centuries later in alchemical treatises, in mystical poetry, in the cryptic language of the Rosicrucians. Wisdom refused to stay buried. Light, even when sealed in vaults, seeps through paper. One story tells of a cardinal who, late in life, confessed before his death that he had once seen a document in the apostolic archive titled Lex Asha, the Law of Truth. He said it was kept in a box marked Ignis, never opened, its edges blackened by fire. We were told, he whispered, that to read it was to risk the soul. He smiled as he died, adding only, "Then perhaps the soul deserves the risk." The Council of Fire has long since vanished from official chronologies. Its decrees dissolved into centuries of theology until no trace of the meeting remained, except in the structure of the faith it built. Even now, the rhythm of its decision hums beneath every creed that replaces clarity with obedience, every prayer that asks for what already exists inside. Its legacy is the habit of looking upward instead of inward. And yet, the Persians would have smiled. They knew that distortion is only temporary. Asha, they said, is falsehood burns out because it consumes itself. Light may be confined, but it is never loyal to its captors. The fire remembers its first shape. Perhaps that is why, in certain old churches, the dawn sun still enters through hidden apertures designed centuries earlier by architects who knew what they were preserving. For a few moments each morning, the rays cross the nave and strike the altar exactly where a flame once burned in another age. And for that instant, the council's edits dissolve, and the truth beneath all translation glows again. They tried to control the fire by renaming it, but language is not a lock. It is a mirror, and every mirror, given time, learns to reflect what was once hidden. Every Christmas, paintings retell the same story. 3 wise men following a star to Bethlehem. a miracle written across the night. But what if the star was not a miracle at all? What if it was a calculation, one the Magi had already written centuries before the story began? In the records of Babylon and ancient Persia, astronomers noted an event they called the Meeting of Kings. It was the conjunction of Jupiter and Saturn in the constellation of Pisces, two wandering lights merging into one, appearing to the naked eye as a single brilliant star. It occurred around the year 7 before the Christian calendar began. To the Magi, Jupiter symbolized divine sovereignty, Saturn represented time and law, and Pisces, the sign of renewal. When these three forces aligned, it meant the birth of a new order, not a child, but an age. The Magi, priests of light and keepers of Asha, watched this slow convergence with reverence. For months, they recorded the changing angles, marking each shift in bronze and stone. They did not read prophecy, they read geometry. To them, the heavens were a manuscript of truth, written in motion instead of ink. And the day the lights became one, they said the world would begin its next cycle of moral awakening. It was never meant to crown a king. It was meant to remind the living that the universe, too, breathes in seasons. Centuries later, when the gospel writers looked for a symbol of divine birth, they borrowed this alignment, not knowing its origin. The miracle was rewritten as revelation, the Persian equation reborn as a Christian omen. The Magi became travelers from distant lands, bearing gifts of obedience instead of instruments of observation. Their scrolls became censored, their science sanctified beyond recognition. But in the secret archives of the Vatican, astronomers kept a quiet fascination with the story. In the 17th century, a Jesuit named Matteo Ricci the Younger was granted limited access to a set of star tables labeled Codex Perseus. What he found unsettled him. The positions of planets matched precisely with those of modern European records, yet the Persian calculations were more accurate than any telescope could have confirmed in their time. Ricci wrote that these tables measure the heavens as if written by the same hand that governs them. Within months, his access was revoked. His remaining notes were confiscated. He was reassigned to a monastery in Malta for contemplation. Still, fragments of his journals survived. In one, he drew two circles overlapping, inscribing beneath them three Latin words: Conjunctio Lucis Aeternis, the union of eternal lights. Later, readers misinterpreted the phrase as mysticism, but Ricci's handwriting faltered in the final line, as though he hesitated. He added, in faint brown ink, "They called it the meeting of worlds." The Church could not publicly admit that the star of its nativity had been predicted by a pre-Christian science. To do so would mean acknowledging that revelation might be measurable, that faith and calculation might share a pulse. So the Persian tables were sealed again, folded into the secret index of prohibited manuscripts, filed, ironically, under the title Astrologia Heretica. Yet the cosmos does not honor secrecy. Every few centuries, the same conjunction returns, faint but precise, a reminder carved into time itself. Astronomers today can trace its rhythm exactly as the Magi did. It is the universe's way of repeating a sentence too important to forget. Light always converges again. Imagine those ancient priests standing on the desert plain, their instruments simple, bronze armillary spheres, ropes marked with shadows, lenses of polished quartz. Around them, the wind moved like breath. They were not looking for gods, they were looking for pattern. They believed that to see order was to become part of it. When they finally observed Jupiter and Saturn join, one whispered, "The heavens remember us." That night, no choirs sang, no angels appeared. only the steady gleam of merged light over the horizon, silent, mathematical, divine. The miracle was not that the star appeared. The miracle was that human eyes recognized it. Centuries later, cathedrals would borrow that same celestial geometry. The circular rose windows, divided into 12 segments, mirror the zodiac the Magi once mapped. The alignment of naves and arches to the solstice sun reflects the same principle, truth revealed through precision. Even the cross, when drawn to scale, aligns perfectly with the motion of the planets across the ecliptic. Architecture became astronomy made of stone. The church built what the Persians had already understood, that light, when ordered, becomes revelation. But unlike the Magi, the builders did not admit their sources. The meeting of worlds became a story of kings kneeling before a manger, not scholars kneeling before the sky. The lesson shifted from awareness to worship, and yet the pattern endured. Every December, when lights are strung in imitation of that long-ago star, the memory of the ancient calculation flickers again, the shadow of a truth too large to vanish. If the Magi could speak now, they would not ask to be remembered as saints or prophets. They would ask only that we look upward with the same patience, the same humility, and the same question that guided them through the cold desert night. What pattern repeats itself in the dark, waiting for us to see it again? Because no miracle is greater than understanding, and no understanding is ever fully lost, only delayed until the next alignment of eyes and light. When the flame of the Magi vanished from Persia's horizon, it rose again in Europe, not as religion, but as geometry. Centuries after the Council of Fire, builders began to raise cathedrals that looked less like shelters and more like prisms. Their blueprints whispered in numbers, older than Latin, perfect circles, equilateral triangles, ratios of harmony that echoed the architecture of the stars. The artisans who designed them called themselves Magistri, Lucy's masters of light, and if you traced their designs backward, far enough, you would find the same mathematics carved into the ruins of fire temples. Gothic cathedrals were not built to enclose light, but to shape it. Their architects studied how flame moved, how it bent air, how it filled space with silence. In the vaulted ceilings of Chartres, in the stained glass of Sainte-Chapelle, you can see the transformation, fire rendered into color, heat distilled into radiance. The walls are thin, not out of fragility, but faith in physics, in balance, in invisible law. Light does not belong to Rome or Persia. It simply travels, taking new forms where it is least expected. The first masons of these cathedrals did not write treatises. They encoded their theology into stone. Every arch was a prayer, every keystone a syllable. They measured not with rulers but with ratios derived from the motion of celestial bodies, the same cycles the Magi once tracked in the desert. They spoke of lumen not as metaphor but as presence. To build, they said, is to remember the shape of light. There are drawings hidden in the margins of medieval manuscripts, diagrams of concentric circles, marked with Persian numerals and strange letters that resemble Avestan. Some historians dismiss them as coincidence. Others know better. A few of the guilds that constructed Europe's greatest cathedrals kept seals bearing a winged symbol, a stylized flame rising from an open hand. Its origin was never explained. The builders claimed it came from the east, where dawn begins. In the cathedral's stained glass, color was the new fire. Red for transformation, blue for clarity, gold for the divine spark, the same hues the Zoroastrian priests had used in their ceremonial robes. The artisans understood what the councils had forgotten, that worship without wonder is empty, and truth without beauty is incomplete. So they made beauty their scripture. When sunlight streamed through those windows, it painted the air with theology. You did not need to read. You only needed to look. The Vatican called these designs miraculous, though the builders themselves said nothing. Some of them had studied under scholars who had read fragments of the Avesta smuggled from the East. They learned that the geometry of the fire temples for equal arches meeting at a dome was not superstition, but science, designed to distribute light evenly across sacred space. They reproduced it in stone and glass, giving Europe its first structures that felt alive with radiance. To step inside was to walk into a prism of memory. At Chartres, legend says that when the first sunlight of summer solstice enters the nave, it strikes a single brass pin embedded in the floor, the meridian of illumination. The beam travels precisely where an ancient Persian temple once aligned its central flame. Whether coincidence or secret inheritance, the message is the same. The world turns and light returns. In time, the Masons' knowledge became myth. Their guilds were accused of sorcery, their formulas buried under symbols. But they understood the old lesson of Asha, that truth, to survive, must disguise itself as art. Better to carve it into architecture than to debate it in councils. Empires may rewrite words, but they cannot unbuild stone. When you stand in a cathedral, you are standing inside a fossil of illumination, a record of how light once thought. The ribbed vaults above you are ribs of a memory stretching from Persia to Rome to France, all tracing the same invisible flame. The stained glass hums with the frequencies of fire. Even the organ's notes vibrate according to ratios derived from the same mathematics as planetary motion. To pray here is to be bathed in science, mistaken for sanctity. Perhaps that is why people still whisper when they enter. The space itself remembers reverence. It teaches without sermon, reminding each visitor that beauty is not decoration, it is proof. Proof that light, when passed through human hands, can become structure. Proof that what was stolen from Persia was never truly lost, only translated into color and sound. In the archives of Rouen, a mason's sketchbook survives. On one page, between designs for arches, he scribbled a sentence in broken Latin: Ignis Dorsit Silentium, fire teaches silence. On the next line, smaller, almost hidden, they built their temples from flame. We build ours from light. Even now, as sunlight filters through stained glass and scatters across marble, the pattern repeats. The old fire still speaks, patient, undiminished. It has changed language, changed continent, changed name, but its message is the same. The cathedral was never built to contain God. It was built so that light could remember itself. In the beginning, Zoroaster's words did not divide heaven and hell. They divided choice. He said, every human being stands between two forces: Asha, the rhythm of truth, and Druj, the distortion that unravels it. There are no intermediaries, no angels to blame, no demons to absolve. The decision belongs to you, every moment, again and again. To loaf is to vote with your breath. That was his greatest gift to the world, and the first heresy Rome could not forgive, because empires require obedience, not conscience. A mind that knows itself free cannot be ruled except by persuasion, and persuasion is weaker than fear. So the idea of free will, that the divine spark in each person could shape the moral fabric of creation, had to be disguised, softened, domesticated. In Rome's hands, it became original sin, a paradox meant to humble what it could not erase. You were still responsible, yes, but for a choice already made before you were born. Your freedom was rewritten as guilt. In the old Persian hymns, there is a phrase repeated like heartbeat. Vohu mana, the good mind. It was the bridge between man and Mazda, between reason and reverence. It said that thought itself is sacred, that to think clearly is to pray. When the Latin translators encountered this phrase, they hesitated. They could not let holiness depend on intellect. So vohu mana became spiritus, sanctus Holy Spirit. Thought became visitation. Reason became grace. The door of choice was closed, and the key renamed miracle. But the Persians never saw freedom as rebellion. They saw it as participation in the divine. Each good act, they believed, tips creation toward harmony. Each lie bends it toward decay. The fate of the cosmos is not decreed. It is composed, moment, by every mind alive. Asha is not the law you obey. It is the law you write through living. Imagine the courage this demands. The understanding that even the smallest kindness carries cosmological weight. That every silence, every deception, ripples across eternity. That you, as you are, help steer the universe. When Rome absorbed this doctrine, it found it intolerable. To say that man could co-create with God blurred the line between subject and master. It was safer to preach submission, safer to promise heaven later than to demand responsibility now. And so the church changed the verbs. In the old Persian text, choose the light. In the Latin version, follow the light. The difference is everything. Choice implies equality. Following implies distance. In the centuries that followed, thinkers who rediscovered the idea of free will, Origen, Pelagius, Giordano Bruno, were condemned or killed. Yet their flames came from the same source. Bruno's last words before the pyre were said to be, "Perhaps you fear more to pronounce my sentence than I to receive it." The echo of Asha spoke through him, the knowledge that obedience cannot sanctify fear. He died, but the fire spoke louder through his ashes. In the hidden liturgies of some medieval mystics, lines survived that betray their Eastern ancestry. One prayer begins, "Within me burns the decision of worlds." Another, "May I act in such harmony that even the stars lean closer." These are not petitions to God. They are affirmations of alignment. The same cosmic accountability Zoroaster taught beneath open sky. The church copied the words, but never grasped their gravity. The weight of freedom was too immense. Even today, the paradox persists. Men ask if destiny is written, if heaven already knows their path. The Persians would have smiled. They would have said, both. The universe knows all possibilities, but it waits for you to choose which one becomes real. Like a fire, it responds to what you feed it. Breath, hesitation, courage. What you call fate is simply habit. What you call miracle is awareness renewed. In the archives of Yazd, there is a charcoal drawing said to depict the moment of awakening. A figure stands between two shadows, one bending toward flame, the other toward smoke. The caption beneath reads, "To stand is to decide." That is the essence of Zoroastrian free will, not to be flawless, but to stay aware, to keep standing where the world prefers you to kneel. And maybe that is why, even after centuries of suppression, the idea survives. Because choice cannot be outlawed. It reappears each time someone refuses silence, each time truth is spoken without permission. The Vatican may hold the scrolls of Asha under lock, but it cannot lock the act of choosing. Every heartbeat is still a vote cast for light or shadow. The Persians had no word for redemption. They had no need. They did not beg forgiveness from the fire. They tended it. They did not confess to the flame, they mirrored it. Freedom was their ritual, awareness their prayer. And though empires have renamed their gods and rewritten their gospels, that one heresy, that luminous defiance remains untouchable. For the truest act of faith is not obedience. It is responsibility. It is standing in the blaze of your own choosing and saying, "Let the world burn brighter for it." Long before laboratories, the Persians practiced a science sanctified by silence. They called it the discipline of Ushata, alignment of the material and the moral. What others called ritual, they called maintenance. Every gesture had a reason. Every rule had a rhythm. They washed not for superstition, but for balance. They tended the earth not from fear of curse, but from understanding of continuity. To them, pollution was not sin, it was imbalance, a tremor in the web of existence. When Zoroaster spoke of purity, he was not speaking of virtue, but of physics. Earth, air, fire, and water were the pillars of consciousness, and to corrupt them was to fracture creation itself. So priests studied winds and currents, soil and flame, learning how each element interacted with the others. They built channels underground, canals, to carry water without exposing it to decay. They purified metal with fire, air with plants, flesh with running water. Theirs was not mysticism. It was the first environmental science. In their scriptures, there is no separation between spiritual and ecological law. To foul a spring, one verse warns, is to teach darkness how to multiply. To burn dead matter near clean flame is forbidden not for dogma, but to protect air's breath. To bury the dead in earth is considered poison. Instead, they offered the body back to the sky, upon stone towers where vultures returned it to the cycle. They called these places Dakmas towers, of silence, not graves, but instruments of renewal. The body ended where light resumed. Roman chroniclers saw these practices and recalled. To them, the Persians were morbid, obsessed with purity, terrified of contamination. They missed the point entirely. The Persians were not afraid of dirt, they were afraid of imbalance. They understood that filth in one realm becomes corruption in another. To poison water is to cloud thought. To cloud thought is to distort truth. And distortion, left unchecked, becomes drudge, the lie. The Vatican later adopted fragments of this wisdom, cloaking them in theology. Holy water replaced flowing streams. Incense replaced the cleansing plants. The architecture of cathedrals, with their ventilation shafts and skylit domes, echoed the environmental design of the fire temples. Yet the purpose shifted from stewardship to spectacle. Where the magi measured air, the priests measured awe. Still, echoes of the old science linger. The Latin phrase, spiritus mundi, the spirit of the world, derives from Zoroastrian cosmology, where breath itself is sacred circulation. Even the modern concept of sanitation descends, indirectly, from Asha's obsession with balance. But Rome never admitted the source. It renamed ecology as morality, transforming physical responsibility into spiritual guilt. If you read the Vendidad, the Persian manual of purity, you will find passages that sound startlingly modern. It describes microbes before microscopes existed, invisible creatures born from rot. Destroy what they touch. It forbids deforestation, commanding that trees must not be cut without renewal, for each root binds light into soil. It even outlines methods of water filtration using sand and sun. To the Persians, these were acts of worship. They purified not for God's approval, but for the planet's endurance. Their priests' mobids were part philosopher, part biologist. They studied how decomposition released subtle vapors, how flame left no residue when fed correctly, One text calls fire the mind of matter. To keep it clean was to keep thought clear. Another line declares, "He who lets smoke darken the ceiling darkens his heart." They believed clarity in the world reflected clarity within. In time, their teachings spread eastward to India and westward into the mystery schools of Greece. Pythagoras, Heraclitus, and later the Stoics borrowed heavily from their environmental mysticism. When Heraclitus said, "All things are exchanged for fire," he was not inventing philosophy, he was translating Zoroaster. The chain of influence is clear, from Persia's deserts to Athens' academies to the cloisters of Europe. The idea that matter is sacred, that consciousness depends on balance, survived through disguise. But when religion became politics, purity became punishment. What had once been hygiene turned into hierarchy. The keepers of light became gatekeepers of salvation. The knowledge of equilibrium of air, fire, water, and soil was declared heretical, then forgotten. The world dimmed, quite literally. Cities choked on smoke, rivers turned opaque, consciences dulled. The lie had found a new form, pollution without guilt. And yet, the old science never died. It merely went dormant, like an ember under ash. It reawakens each time someone studies how breath moves, how water heals, how sunlight clarifies the mind. It reappears in laboratories measuring climate, in hospitals sterilizing flame. In every act that remembers the world is a living organism. Perhaps that is the hidden irony. The faith once condemned as pagan impurity has become the foundation of modern purity itself. Science is the language of Asha, translated for those who no longer believe in gods. The Persians would smile. For them, it was never about belief, it was about participation. They did not worship the elements, they collaborated with them. So when a scientist today filters water or charts the ozone, he performs a forgotten liturgy. When a nurse disinfects a wound, when a gardener plants where roots can breathe, when a child lights a candle and watches its flame steady itself, that is the same prayer Zoroaster once whispered. Keep the fire clean, keep the balance clear. The world remembers who tends it, because the temple was never a building. It was the planet itself, and we are still its priests. When empires fall, truth does not die, it migrates. So it was with the followers of the flame. After the Arab conquest of Persia in the 7th century, when the sacred fires were extinguished and the priests scattered, a few carried embers west across the desert and east along the silk routes. They became wanderers, refugees of light, traveling not for land, but for memory. They called themselves Parsis, the Persians, though the name slowly became their disguise. In their small caravans, they carried no gold, no relics, only ash wrapped in silk, the residue of their ancestral fires. They traveled by night, using the stars as compass, the same constellations their ancestors had read as scripture. At dawn, they stopped to kindle their hidden embers anew, whispering a line from the Avesta, even in exile. The fire knows its direction. They reached India's western coast, a place of monsoon and salt wind. The local rulers, puzzled by their strange rituals and veiled fires, asked what they sought. Their leader, an old mob named Nereosang, answered, "Only space enough for flame." And so they were granted refuge near Gujarat, where they built small temples of white stone, vented to the sky, each housing a spark of the old Atash Beram. The fire survived its homeland by changing it. The Parsis became merchants, scholars, healers. They traded silks and spices, but also knowledge. They brought with them the art of water management, the geometry of light, the mathematics of harmony. They taught purification not as superstition but as science, reminding a new civilization that the body and the world are the same equation. For centuries, they lived quietly, their fires burning unnoticed, their language fading, their truth intact. Yet exile has its own alchemy. What cannot be defended must be carried within. Cut off from empire and temple, the Parsis turned inward. They no longer guarded fire as property, but as principle. The truest flame, their teachers said, is the one that survives without permission. In their diaspora, Zoroastrianism transformed from religion into resilience, an inheritance of clarity. Even when converts were forbidden, they taught their children one lesson. We do not own the light. We only remember it. Travelers who visited their settlements in the following centuries described the same strange peace. The temples were small, almost bare. No statues, no wealth, only a flame behind glass. When asked why they preserved such a fragile thing, a priest replied, "Because the world is waiting for its reflection." And indeed, their light began to reflect in ways the church never foresaw. Scholars from the West came seeking Persian manuscripts, expecting magic and finding reason. The first to compare Zoroastrian hymns with Hebrew psalms was astonished at the symmetry. Both spoke of conscience as divine law, of light as judgment, of breath as prayer. Paradoxically, the faith that Europe once condemned as heresy became one of its unacknowledged ancestors. Even now, the Parsis of India guard for living fires that trace unbroken lineage to the ancient ones. Scientists who analyzed their combustion patterns found them cleaner than any modern fuel. No soot, no smoke, just radiant heat, as if matter itself remembered how to burn without sin. Some say the priests keep a hidden mixture of sandalwood and rare herbs. Others believe it is the purity of intention that sustains it. Perhaps both are true, for the Persians taught that substance and spirit are the same element seen from different sides of the flame. But exile did not end in India. The descendants of those keepers of fire scattered further to Singapore, to London, to San Francisco. Wherever they went, they built small temples, always facing east. To outsiders, they seemed quaint, archaic, nearly invisible. Yet in every city where their fires burn, air quality improves, as if the world itself responds to being remembered. In one Parsi home in Mumbai, the priest's granddaughter still lights a candle each night, whispering the same words her ancestors spoke under Roman persecution. "I do not pray for light, I remember it." Their story is the most quiet of miracles. A religion nearly erased became the guardian of the oldest human instinct to keep something alive because it is beautiful. When the church built vaults to hide forbidden texts, the Parsis built windows to share theirs with the wind. They proved what the conquerors had never understood, that survival is not the opposite of defeat. It is the art of gentle persistence. The Persians believed that even one honest heart could keep creation in balance. The Parsis lived that creed. Without armies, without evangelism, they preserved a civilization through memory alone. Each flame they kindled became a heartbeat of history. Each ritual of cleansing, a quiet defiance against oblivion. When the world forgot Asha, they kept its rhythm alive in the way they breathed, worked, cooked, spoke. Exile turned them into the custodians of continuity. Some say that within the Vatican's oldest vault lies a sealed lamp, a flame taken from Persia during the conquests, still burning behind glass. If that story is true, perhaps the exile of light was never absolute. Perhaps even its captors became its caretakers, because light, once seen, demands stewardship. It does not fade. It migrates through hands, through hearts, through time. And so the fire wandered the earth, disguised as knowledge, as conscience, as compassion. You can trace its journey in every age, in the spark of a scholar's candle, in the lens of Galileo, in the beaker of Newton, in the circuits of our own machines. The technology of light is only the latest form of that same migration. The Parsis still say, the fire does not ask to be remembered, it remembers you. Exile is not the death of light, it is the proof that light knows how to travel. Beneath the Vatican lies a labyrinth that most maps refuse to draw. The public knows the archive's climate-controlled corridors, where popes and scholars once signed decrees, where parchment sleeps behind glass. But deeper still, below the marble and the centuries, whispers speak of another chamber. It has no catalogue number, no listed key. Its name, when it appears at all, is written only as Persevault. To some, it is rumor. To others, the Vatican's most delicate confession. The oldest reference comes from an inventory written in 1562 by a librarian named Bartolomeo della Torre. In a list of forbidden manuscripts, he added one line without explanation. One chest of foreign origin, contents sealed by decree of the Council of Fire. The words were later crossed out in red ink, but the mark remains, a scar in paper that refuses to heal. Scholars who tried to trace the chester's history found only fragments. A shipment of scrolls seized from Eastern Magi, a report of texts speaking of light as law, and an order to bury them where no prayer may reach. The Persevault, if it exists, lies beyond the main archive's final door. A threshold guarded not by soldiers, but by obscurity. Even cardinals speak of it only in metaphor. One described it as a tomb for knowledge that will not die. Another, more daring, called it a sanctuary for truths the Church was not ready to face. In hushed tones, archivists admit that certain maps of the sublevels end abruptly, as if corridors were erased rather than sealed. Some say the air grows warm near those walls. Some say it hums. Imagine the room, stone older than Christianity, air heavy with silence. Within it, chests lined with bronze. Inside them, pages that survived conquest, flame, and exile. The remnants of Zoroaster's fire rendered into words. Perhaps the original Avesta, perhaps copies made by the Magi who fled west. Perhaps nothing but dust, but even dust remembers. The few who claim to have seen the vault speak of symbols carved above its arch, a winged figure holding a circle of flame. It is not a Christian image. It belongs to Ahura Mazda, the Lord of Light. Why would such a symbol adorn a chamber in Rome? Because the Church, in its earliest centuries, absorbed what it could not erase. The vault is the wound left by assimilation, a scar so deep it glows. In the 1920s, during renovations of the Apostolic Palace, a workman reported finding a sealed bronze door beneath the north crypt. Behind it, he heard a faint resonance, as if wind moved inside stone. His report was dismissed, and the door reburied under concrete. But before leaving, he scratched one phrase into the scaffolding: Il fuoco respira ancora. The fire still breathes. The inscription was quietly removed. If the vault holds what legend claims, its purpose is paradox. The Church preserved the very texts it condemned. To destroy them outright would have been to acknowledge their power. To keep them hidden was safer. So it became a kind of reverse temple, a place where fire was buried in shadow, where truth was kept alive by confinement. And yet, this is what makes the vault the purest of sanctuaries. For all prisons are also safes. What is hidden is also protected. In trying to silence the flame, Rome became its final custodian. Perhaps that is why, on certain feast days when incense fills the basilica, some observers notice a strange heat rising from the floor, Not smoke, not breath, but warmth that lingers longer than the candles above. The priests do not mention it, but those who stand still enough say they feel a pulse, faint but steady, as though beneath all the marble, a heartbeat continues. What if that warmth is the echo of Asha itself, the memory of balance radiating through time? What if the Persia vault is not a vault at all, but a mirror, reflecting humanity's long struggle between knowledge and authority, between inner flame and outer faith? The Vatican's secrecy, the Magi's exile, the wars of translation, all branches of the same tree, roots tangled around the same light. To the Church, the vault is an embarrassment, a reminder that the foundations of its theology were laid atop older altars. To historians, it is a mystery of archives. But to those who remember, it is something else entirely. The last station of the fire's pilgrimage, the place where light learned to hide. And maybe that is why no one opens it. Because to open it would be to admit that what lies inside has been whispering all along through stained glass and scripture, through architecture and conscience, teaching the same truth Rome once feared to read, that God is not above us. He is the law by which we think. And that law was never Roman, it was fire. Somewhere beneath the city, that fire still breathes, unseen but unforgotten. It hums in the walls, in the silence between prayers, in the soft pulse of light that filters through stone. You can almost hear it if you close your eyes, the faint sound of warmth waiting to be remembered. Because no vault, however deep, can hide illumination. Light is patient. It waits beneath every empire, rehearsing its return. At last, the journey folds inward. All the temples, vaults, and scriptures converge to one place that has no door. You, because the fire they built from stone was never meant to stay there. It was only a rehearsal for the moment when awareness learned to burn without wood, without oil, without permission. The Persians understood this. When the outer flame is extinguished, the real work begins. They called it Atar, within the invisible light that neither empire nor darkness can touch. Close your eyes. Beneath thought, beneath noise, something flickers, a pulse. You have felt it in every moment of honesty. In every breath, you refuse to surrender to despair. That is the oldest temple, the chamber Rome could not find, the vault that cannot be sealed. The true Atash Baram consciousness, remembering its own warmth. When the Magi read the stars, they were not mapping heaven. They were measuring themselves, reflected in the geometry of light. When the passes carried fire across continents, they were carrying their own endurance. When the cathedrals rose, their builders were not raising new faiths, they were giving shape to memory. And when the Vatican buried the old scrolls, it unwittingly protected them, ensuring that their resonance would outlive censorship. Every act of suppression has kept the flame alive by forcing it inward, refining it, condensing it to its essence. The inner fire is not belief, it is clarity. It burns quietly beneath every story we tell, beneath science, art, prayer. It whispers the same message through all languages, that truth is not granted, it is generated. Each thought, each kindness, each decision aligned with awareness adds oxygen to that hidden blaze. Each lie smothers it. The moral physics of Asha still governs the unseen. Reality balances itself according to what we choose to illuminate. You can feel it in silence, that hum beneath the noise of the world. It is the same hum that once filled the temples of Yazd, the same that trembled under Rome's foundations. The priests called it divinity, physicists call it energy, poets call it breath. It has no name because it is the name beneath all others. And this is the secret the Vatican never dared to declare, that illumination needs no intercession, that conscience is communion, that the voice they called heresy was only the echo of our own. You do not find God by ascending a hierarchy. You find him by recognizing the architecture within your chest, the same geometry that binds the stars. Somewhere beneath the basilicas, the Persia vault still waits. Sealed in the earth like a memory, the world has not yet forgiven itself for forgetting. But the truth it guards no longer needs rescuing. The pages were never the fire. They were only its shadow. The flame itself has migrated into language, into thought, into the quiet persistence of every human being who still seeks light instead of fear. You are part of that lineage, whether you believe it or not. Every time you pause before speaking, every time you choose integrity over ease, you tend the same eternal flame. It is not holy, it is human, and perhaps that is what makes it sacred. One day, the vault will open, not with keys, but with comprehension. And when it does, no revelation will burst forth, no thunder, no angels, only recognition that the light we buried was never elsewhere. It has always been looking out through our eyes, waiting for us to stop searching long enough to remember. So breathe, let the world be your temple. Let the fire behind your thoughts steady itself. It does not ask for prayer, only awareness. It does not consume, it clarifies. That is how truth survives the centuries, not by victory, but by vigilance. Rome could bury scrolls. It could rename gods. It could build vaults so deep that no map dares to mark them. But it could never extinguish what was never outside to begin with. The hidden flame beneath its stones, the hum beneath your pulse, they are the same phenomenon, the memory of consciousness glowing through matter. And so we arrive where the story began, not beneath the Vatican, not in the desert, but in the quiet place between two breaths. The fire has traveled through empire and exile, through translation and silence, only to return home. The temple was always the body, the priest, the mind, the flame, the act of seeing clearly. They tried to bury it under marble, but marble, too, remembers heat. The flame is not a relic, it is recognition. It cannot be borrowed, it cannot be stolen. It is you.